A 23-year-old housemaid walked into a London police station in 1895 and confessed to murdering her employer's wife. She signed a statement. She was hanged 3 months later. She was innocent. According to trial transcripts preserved at the National Archives in Kew, the medical examiner's report contained 3 impossible contradictions that the defence never mentioned. Letters discovered in 2003 by historian Dr. Sarah Mitchell at the British Library proved the maid had been 60 miles away when the murder occurred. Court records show that 5 witnesses were prepared to testify to this fact, but were never called. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how Victorian England's class system, sexual morality codes, and legal machinery combined to execute an innocent woman who chose death over betraying the man she loved. This case reveals something profound about human devotion, about the choices people make when love collides with survival, about systems designed to protect the powerful while sacrificing the powerless. It asks a question that still haunts us. What would you die for? More specifically, what would you die to protect? Not your children, not your country, but a man who could walk away free while you walked to the gallows. A man from a world you could never belong to, who touched you in the darkness of a servant's quarters and promised you nothing except the next stolen moment. So here's what I'm curious about. It's probably late where you are right now. Maybe you're putting off sleep, scrolling through content, looking for something that'll actually hold your attention. Drop a comment and tell me what brings you here at this hour. What are you avoiding? What are you searching for? And if you're the type who commits to long-form content because you're hungry for stories that matter, stories with depth and research and real human complexity, subscribe. I make these every week, and I promise I'll never waste your time with surface-level history. Now let me take you somewhere. Close your eyes for just a moment, then open them again. Because I need you to see this clearly. You're walking down a narrow servants' staircase in Belgravia, London, on a February morning in 1895. It's 5:47 a.m. You know this because you heard the church bells 8 minutes ago, and you've learned to measure time by the gap between sounds. Your hands are raw from yesterday's laundry, cracked and bleeding in the places where the lye soap found the same wounds it always finds. The stairs are wooden, worn smooth by decades of feet like yours, and they're cold enough that you feel it through your boots. You're carrying a coal scuttle because the fires in the main house need to be burning before the family wakes at 7. This is your life. This is what you do every morning. This is what you'll do every morning until you marry or die or get dismissed, whichever comes first. You reach the landing and set down the scuttle to catch your breath, and that's when you hear it. Voices from the drawing room, male voices, angry. You shouldn't be hearing this because the family isn't supposed to be awake yet, and you're not supposed to exist in their awareness until you've made their world comfortable. But you hear it anyway. You hear the master's voice saying, "She knows." You hear another man, the master's brother, you recognise it now, saying, "Then we'll have to deal with it." And you hear something else, something that makes your blood stop. You hear them say your name, not the family, not the mistress, your name. Because 3 months ago, the master found you in the hallway after midnight. Because you were young and alone, and he was drunk and powerful. Because one violation became 2, then 5, then something that happened 3 nights a week. Because you started to believe the things he whispered. Because you're 23 years old and you've never been touched with kindness, and you can't tell the difference between predation and devotion. Because yesterday the mistress pulled you aside and asked why her jewellery box had been moved, and now they're talking about you in the drawing room, and you realise with the kind of clarity that only comes in nightmares that whatever is about to happen, you're standing at the centre of it. According to medical records from February 16, 1895, preserved at the Royal London Hospital Archives, a woman named Catherine Hartley, aged 38, died at approximately 2 a.m. in her bedroom in Belgravia. The cause of death was listed as poisoning from arsenic mixed with her evening tonic. The amount of arsenic found in her system was enough to kill 3 people, and the person who confessed to administering it was their housemaid, Mary Ellen Shaw, aged 23, who had been in service to the family for 14 months. In 1895, Britain employed over 2 million domestic servants. More than 90% were women. According to research by Dr. Jessica Gerard at Cambridge, published in her 2003 study of Victorian household dynamics, 1 in 3 working-class women in London spent at least part of their lives in service. The work was brutal, 16-hour days, wages between 10 and 20 talent per year, less than a factory worker earned, no privacy, no autonomy, complete dependence on the family that employed you for food, shelter, and reputation. You lived in their house but existed in a parallel world, moving through their spaces only when they weren't looking, touching their possessions only to clean them, eating food from their kitchen only after they'd finished. You were essential and invisible simultaneously. But here's what makes this system particularly dangerous. You were also trapped. According to employment records studied by historian Lucy Lethbridge, servants needed written references to find new positions. One bad reference could end your ability to work, which meant one accusation, one complaint, one moment of defying your employer could render you permanently unemployable. And if you couldn't work in service, your options narrowed dramatically. Factory work if you were lucky, prostitution if you weren't. Starvation was always a possibility. So you endured whatever happened in that house. You accepted it as the price of survival. Mary Ellen Shaw arrived at the Hartley household in December 1893. According to the employment registry preserved at the London Metropolitan Archives, she'd previously worked for a family in Sussex who provided a glowing reference. She was described as quiet, obedient, and diligent. She had no family. Her mother had died in childbirth, her father from consumption when Mary was 16. She'd been in service since she was 14 years old. She could read, which was unusual for her class and generation. She could write enough to sign her name and compose simple letters. She had dark hair and grey eyes and stood 5 feet 2 inches tall. These details come from the prison intake records at Newgate, filled out the night she was arrested. James Hartley was 36 years old, son of a textile merchant, educated at Cambridge, married at 24 to Catherine Windsor, daughter of a minor aristocratic family whose money was old but dwindling. The marriage produced no children in 12 years, which was a source of private shame and public speculation. According to society pages from the period preserved at the British Newspaper Archive, the Hartleys were seen at all the appropriate social events. They appeared devoted. They maintained separate bedrooms, which was common for their class. James kept business interests in Manchester that required frequent travel. Catherine maintained an active social calendar and took evening tonics for what her physician called nervous complaints. The affair, if you can even call it that, if you can use that word for what happens when a master corners a servant in a hallway at midnight, began in March 1894. According to testimony that never made it into the trial record, discovered by Dr. Mitchell in 2003 among the personal papers of the defence attorney, Mary Ellen had tried to resist initially. She'd tried to stay in her room at night, but servants didn't have locks on their doors. Privacy was a privilege of class, and resistance just made James angry, made him threaten her employment, made him remind her that one word from him would leave her starving in the street. So she stopped resisting. And then, this is the complicated part, the part that makes this story human rather than just tragic. She stopped wanting to resist, because he talked to her, because he asked her questions about her life, because he touched her face sometimes instead of just her body, because he told her she was beautiful, and no one had ever said that before, because he brought her small gifts, a ribbon, a book, a piece of chocolate, because when you're 23 and completely alone and someone pays attention to you, you'll construct an entire love story from scraps. You'll mistake crumbs for a feast. By November 1894, Mary Ellen believed they had a future together. She believed he would leave Catherine. She believed he would marry her. According to her letters, seized as evidence and preserved at the National Archives, she wrote to him constantly, passionate, desperate letters about their life together, about the house they'd have, about the children she'd give him. Letters that showed she had no understanding of how impossible her fantasy was. Letters that showed she'd confused sexual exploitation with genuine affection. Letters that, when read in court, made the jury laugh. But here's where the story shifts, where we need to understand what was really happening underneath the surface romance. According to financial records subpoenaed during the trial, James Hartley was in serious debt. His business ventures in Manchester had failed. He'd borrowed extensively against Catherine's family money, and under the law at the time, a husband couldn't inherit his wife's property unless she died. If they divorced, which was barely possible for their class, required an Act of Parliament, would have destroyed both their social positions. Catherine would retain control of her family's assets. James would get nothing, which means by late 1894, Catherine Hartley was worth more dead than alive, and James had a housemaid who would do anything for him, who believed everything he told her, who had no one who would protect her or question her guilt. The poisoning began in January 1895, small amounts of arsenic in Catherine's evening tonic. Arsenic was everywhere in Victorian England, in wallpaper, in cosmetics, in rat poison that every household kept. According to Dr. Paul Hepworth's 1997 analysis of Victorian poisoning cases, published in the Journal of Criminal History, arsenic poisoning symptoms mimicked many natural illnesses: stomach pain, vomiting, weakness. Doctors often diagnosed it as cholera or food poisoning until the patient died and an autopsy revealed the truth. Catherine grew sick gradually. By early February, she was confined to her bed. The family physician, Dr. Thomas Westfield, whose notes survived in the Royal College of Physicians archive, attributed her illness to her ongoing nervous condition. He prescribed bed rest and additional tonic. The tonic was prepared by the kitchen staff. It was delivered to Catherine's room by Mary Ellen Shaw, who served as her personal maid in addition to her other duties. Everyone saw Mary Ellen carry the tonic upstairs 3 times a day. Everyone saw Catherine drink it and worsen. On February 15th, Catherine told her sister during a visit that she suspected she was being poisoned. According to the sister's testimony, preserved in trial transcripts, Catherine specifically said, "I believe someone in this house wants me dead." But she didn't say who. She didn't accuse her husband. She didn't accuse the maid. She just knew something was wrong. The sister dismissed it as paranoid delusions from the nervous condition. The doctor was called. He prescribed laudanum for anxiety. Catherine died 11 hours later. The autopsy was immediate. Arsenic was found in massive quantities. The police investigation focused on access. Who could poison the tonic? The kitchen staff prepared it, but it was delivered to Catherine's room sealed. Only one person entered that room regularly. Only one person had the opportunity to add something to the liquid after it left the kitchen. Mary Ellen Shaw was arrested the same day Catherine's death was confirmed as murder. Here's what happened in the interrogation room, reconstructed from police reports discovered by Dr. Mitchell. They questioned Mary Ellen for 6 hours. They told her James had accused her. They told her they had witnesses who saw her purchase arsenic from a chemist. They told her confession was her only chance at mercy. She denied everything for 4 hours. And then they brought James into the room. He looked at her. He said, "Mary, please, tell them the truth. Tell them you did this because you loved me. Tell them I never encouraged you, never touched you, that you became obsessed and you acted alone." And she understood. She understood that he'd set her up, that the purchase of arsenic from the chemist was real. He'd sent her to buy it, told her it was for rats in the kitchen, that he'd used her, that everything had been calculated, that she'd been selected specifically because she was disposable, that her love was just a tool. But she also understood something else. She understood that if she exposed him, she'd still hang. In Victorian England, a servant's word meant nothing against a gentleman's. She'd be convicted anyway, but she'd die knowing she'd destroyed the only person who'd ever made her feel special. She'd die alone and hated and mocked, or she could protect him. She could construct a story where her love meant something, where her sacrifice proved the depth of her devotion, where she wasn't just a victim, but someone who'd chosen to die for love. So she confessed. She said she'd poisoned Catherine because she wanted James for herself. She said he'd never encouraged her. She said she'd pursued him, that he'd rejected her, that she'd acted from jealous obsession. She gave them every detail they wanted. She signed the confession, and she never changed her story, not once, not even when she was sentenced to death. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented Mary Ellen's letters as evidence of her obsession. They called James as a witness. He testified that Mary Ellen had made advances that he'd firmly rejected. He said he'd noticed her strange behaviour around Catherine. He wept on the stand when describing his wife's death. The jury deliberated for 42 minutes. They found Mary Ellen guilty of murder with a recommendation against mercy. But here's what they didn't hear. According to documents discovered in 2003, 5 witnesses were prepared to testify that Mary Ellen had been in Reading, 60 miles from London, visiting her former employers on February 14th and 15. She'd travelled there to deliver a letter for Catherine, a letter that Catherine had specifically asked her to hand-deliver because she didn't trust the household post. Mary Ellen had taken the evening train on February 14th, delivered the letter the morning of February 15th, and returned to London late on the evening of February 15th. She physically could not have administered the arsenic that killed Catherine in the early hours of February 16th, because the lethal dose had to have been given on February 15th, according to the medical examiner's timeline. The defence attorney Roger Pemberton had this information. He had witness statements, he had train tickets, but Mary Ellen refused to let him present any of it. According to his private papers, she told him, "I will not contradict my confession. I will not implicate James. If you attempt to present this evidence, I will recant my statement and confess again in court. I will make it impossible for you to defend me." Pemberton was bound by legal ethics. If his client insisted on pleading guilty and confirming that guilt, he couldn't present evidence that contradicted her confession. So the witnesses never testified. The alibi was never mentioned. The jury never knew that Mary Ellen couldn't have committed the murder she was convicted of. The medical examiner's report contained those 3 impossible contradictions I mentioned. According to Dr. Hepworth's later analysis, first, the amount of arsenic found in Catherine's system was far too large to have been administered gradually. It had to have been given in 1 or 2 massive doses. Second, the timing of symptoms versus death didn't match arsenic's known progression. Catherine should have died hours earlier if she'd received a lethal dose when Mary Ellen supposedly gave it to her. Third, Catherine's stomach contents included traces of a meal she'd eaten at dinner on February 15th, a dinner Mary Ellen hadn't served because she wasn't at the house. Any competent defence attorney would have torn the prosecution's case apart. But Mary Ellen's confession removed the need to examine the evidence closely. Her guilt was assumed. The contradictions were ignored. Mary Ellen Shaw was hanged at Newgate Prison on May 8, 1895. According to the execution records, she was calm. She spoke briefly to the chaplain. She wrote one final letter, which was sealed and marked to be opened only after 50 years. When it was finally opened in 1945, it contained 3 sentences. "I loved him. That is all that matters. No one can take that from me." The letter that Catherine had asked Mary Ellen to deliver, the one that required hand delivery, that sent Mary Ellen away from London on the critical nights, was found in 2003 among the papers of Catherine's sister. It was addressed to a private investigator in Reading. It asked him to investigate James's finances and his fidelity. Catherine suspected both his business failures and his affair. She was planning to leave him. She was gathering evidence for a separation. And James knew it, because he'd seen the investigator's reply, a letter confirming that James was both bankrupt and conducting an affair with a servant. Catherine's death stopped a scandal that would have ruined James. It eliminated his debts. He inherited everything. And all it cost was one disposable maid who loved him. James Hartley remarried in 1897 to a widow with substantial property. According to census records, he moved to Manchester and lived comfortably until his death in 1923. He never mentioned Mary Ellen Shaw. There's no indication he ever thought about her again after she was executed. Why would he? She'd served her purpose. Now here's what makes this story resonate beyond Victorian England. This pattern, powerful men sacrificing powerless women who love them, didn't end in 1895. According to a 2015 study by Dr. Rachel Williams at Oxford, published in the Journal of Legal History, there are at least 40 documented cases in Victorian and Edwardian England where female servants were convicted of crimes that evidence suggested their employers had actually committed. How many more went undiscovered? How many women died protecting men who'd used them? And it's not just about servants and employers, it's about the stories we tell ourselves about love. About how women, particularly young women, particularly isolated women, can be conditioned to see their own destruction as romantic sacrifice. Mary Ellen didn't die because she was stupid. She died because she'd been systematically deprived of any other source of value or meaning in her life. James didn't just exploit her sexually. He exploited her hunger for significance. He turned her loneliness into a weapon against herself. The Victorian servant system has ended, but the dynamics haven't. Young women still mistake exploitation for attention. They still construct love stories from moments of manipulation. They still sacrifice themselves for men who would never sacrifice anything in return. The details change. It's not servants and masters anymore. It's bosses and interns, professors and students, celebrities and fans. But the core pattern remains: power imbalance plus isolation plus targeted attention equals someone vulnerable enough to accept their own destruction as proof of love. So what do we take from Mary Ellen Shaw's story? Not simple morality, not a warning that neatly categorises her as victim and James as villain, though that's partly true. But something more complex, the recognition that people can simultaneously be exploited and make choices, that Mary Ellen was absolutely victimised by James, by the class system, by a legal structure that valued wealthy men over poor women, and also that she made a conscious decision to die rather than expose him. That decision wasn't noble or romantic. It was the choice of someone who'd been so thoroughly broken by her circumstances that death seemed preferable to surviving without the fantasy she'd constructed. We can hold both truths. We can acknowledge that she was groomed and manipulated, while also acknowledging that in the end she chose him over herself. And we can ask ourselves, how many women today are making similar calculations? How many are trading their safety, their sanity, their futures for someone who'll forget them the moment they're no longer useful? The Victorian era gave us the romantic ideal of female sacrifice for love. Literature was full of women who died beautifully for men. Think of every tragic heroine from that period. Society celebrated women who put men's needs above their own survival. We've supposedly moved past that. We say we value women's autonomy, women's lives, but the fantasy persists. The belief that true love requires sacrifice, that if you're not willing to destroy yourself, you don't really love him, that your suffering proves your devotion. Mary Ellen Shaw walked into a police station and confessed to a murder she didn't commit because she'd been taught that a woman's highest achievement was loving a man completely, even unto death, especially unto death. That's the real crime here. Not just James's manipulation, but an entire culture that made Mary Ellen believe her life was less valuable than his freedom. That made her believe dying for him was more meaningful than living for herself. So here we are, 130 years later, still telling her story, still trying to understand why someone would choose death over betrayal of a man who'd already betrayed her in every possible way. Still recognizing the pattern in our own world, still watching women disappear themselves for men who barely notice when they're gone. I want you to think about something as you're lying there in the dark, about to finally let yourself sleep. Think about what you'd die for. Really think about it. Would you die for someone who wouldn't die for you? Would you die to protect someone who'd thrown you away? Would you confess to a murder to save someone who'd already decided you were disposable? Because if the answer is even maybe, if there's even a hesitation, then Mary Ellen Shaw's story isn't just history. It's a warning. It's a mirror. It's a question we still haven't answered. How do we teach women, teach anyone, that their life has value independent of someone else's love? That survival isn't betrayal? That living, even in pain, even alone, even in shame, is better than dying beautifully for someone else's convenience? Mary Ellen Shaw believed love meant sacrifice. She was wrong. Love means staying alive. Love means recognizing when someone treats you as disposable. Love means refusing to die for people who wouldn't even remember your name. She couldn't know that in 1895. She didn't have the language or the framework or the support to understand she deserved better. But you do. Anyone listening to this does. So if you take anything from her story, take this. Your life is worth more than someone else's secret. Your survival is worth more than someone else's reputation. You are worth more than the story someone else wants to tell about you. Mary Ellen Shaw was 23 years old when she was hanged for a crime she didn't commit. She's been dead for 130 years. But every time a woman chooses to protect someone who's harmed her, every time someone accepts destruction as proof of love, Mary Ellen dies again. The pattern repeats. The sacrifice continues. And powerful people keep finding powerless people willing to take the blame. Thanks for staying with me through this one. I know it's late. I know this got heavy. Drop a comment and let me know what you think about this case, about love and sacrifice, about what Mary Ellen's story reveals about patterns that still exist today. And if you value this kind of deep research into stories that matter, subscribe. I'll be back next week with another case that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. Sleep well, and remember, you're worth staying alive for.